Welcome to the On the Trail podcast. For this week's compilation episode, we are revisiting the Joy and Fear House series.
Father, you were raised with a very voluntarist mindset. Please explain, what is voluntarism?
What is voluntarism? Well, I didn't know I was a voluntarist. But all of us evangelicals were, but we just didn't know it. So voluntarism is a philosophical system that says the will. You can hear that Latin word vala. Vala, what is the Latin word? Do you remember?
Voluntas? It can take different forms.
Yeah, voluntas. Yeah. So you can kind of hear that Latin word for the will in here. And it's this idea that our life choices are at the foundation and the heart of what it means to be human. Well, there's obviously a lot of truth to that, right? Choices form a lot of the things that we do. And so voluntarism basically says that believe the right things, make the right choices, and things will change and your life will be better. And so we are taught to preach the truth and encourage people to make choices based on that. But that was it. That was the whole system. It was kind of like, here, believe the right things, make the right choices, everything will change. So that's essentially what voluntarism is. Like even my own father, right? We were all raised this way. He used to say all the time, it would be nice to write a book called Believe Right, Live Right. Because he kind of had it in his mind, if we can just get people to believe the right things, then everything else will flow from there. So we got a lot of evangelical literature on, common lies people believe, and this is a choice, and that is a choice, and salvation is a decision. And while there's elements of truth in all of that, it misses a whole bunch of other things. And so that's what we're trying to correct. And we'll get to this idea because I was a happy voluntarist, didn't know it, just going along and trying hard to make my Christianity work. And then I watched these, videos by Jim Wilder called Joy Bonds, and it just sort of blew my brain up. So I was like, what is going on here? So
mind blown.
Yeah.
Yes. And I do think it's important to circle back just to the fact that beliefs and choice are very important. We're not discounting that. It's just, what role do you ask them to play in transformation and in...
Yeah, the problem isn't with right belief and right choice. The problem is asking them to do all of the heavy lifting. It's like if it's all just this. And so we create too much of this impression, and especially for what's been called the duty generation. That was a very sensible thing. Okay, I'll do my duty. You just tell me what choice to make and I'll go make it. And so we're finding out that there's actually something deeper going on, even in the Bible and in the brain, than just beliefs and choices.
So, joy bonds, the two words that blew up your old paradigm. How did you discover joy bonds?
So, in 2005, 2006, made the transition from being a pastor to starting Deeper Walk Ministries as a discipleship organization to seeing the ministry merge with ICBC and becoming the president of that organization. And through ICBC, I got access to a whole lot of training curriculum. And one of them was a set of workshops that Dr. Wilder had done at a recent ICBC conference. And it was simply called Joy Bonds. And it was one of those things, you talk about dense, right? He was going through there, and it's one of those things where you watch for 3 minutes, you pause it while you take notes and think, and then you watch for 5 minutes and you pause it while you take notes and think, because it was just so packed with, vocabulary I'd never interacted with brain science I'd never heard of before, with a paradigm shift I was unfamiliar with. And as it began to sink in, I began to get it. I was like, this is going to change everything. And it really has.
So I guess we're holding ourselves in suspense here. What are joy bonds?
Yeah, what are joy bonds? Okay, so the two words. So joy basically was this idea that joy was not on my radar, right? It was my idea of Christianity was duty and intimacy, but the idea of intimacy with God was basically spiritual disciplines, and that is do spiritual disciplines, form your intimacy with God. And there wasn't really a category for joy in my thinking that much, other than I know the joy of the Lord is my strength, and they talked about joy now and then, but it felt like a minor theme in the Bible. It was not a central idea. And so just that shift to the idea that, wait, joy is actually central and not just icing on the cake. And then the idea that the brain is actually wired for joy and wants to run on joy. This tells me something about God, right? So if God wired my brain to run on joy, that tells me that joy was God's plan for my life. Well, that got my attention. And then you get the word bonds, which has to do with attachment. And this is the idea that there is below the level of cognition, shall we say, below the level of my thinking and my analyzing and my, belief system, there is my attachment system. And what I find is that my attachment system will either bond to people in fear or bond to people in joy. And so all of a sudden, just learning that there was a system called the attachment system, just learning that there was something deeper going on than just my thinking was revelatory, right? And then understanding the power of these attachments and how so many of my beliefs were actually driven by my bonds or my attachments, even more so than when I realized. And then you put all this together and going joy and bonds, of those two things just kind of blew up my little voluntarist world. And I realized, all right, I'm going to have to rethink everything because it's that kind of a paradigm shifting idea.
And we're going to just keep unpacking, and it's going to be great. So while this series is about joy, we're going to be talking probably a lot about attachment and maturity because they're pretty inseparable. Do you have anything up front that you want to say about attachment first?
Yeah, so the model I taught and that I thought explained everything was a worldview model that said at the heart of culture is the worldview, and then from the worldview come the values, and from the values come behavior. But what I began to realize is that deeper than even the worldview is the belonging that there is in a culture. So it's like in my little subgroup, my people, I have a sense of belonging that these are my people. And whoever I feel that belonging to is going to influence which worldview I embrace. So, if my parents, were missionaries in tribal Africa, if you're a member of that tribe, then your worldview and your values are going to tend to be similar to one another. So what is this driving force that gives everybody embracing the same worldview? Is everybody embracing the same values and living in the same basic way? And the answer is that they have such a strong attachment to each other. And so I realized that this attachment was actually a deeper driving force than even worldview itself. And so that was like, wow, I've really got to think about that one, because I just always assumed worldview was it, especially when it comes to Christianity, because we tend to think that we became Christians to embrace the worldview and that formed our belonging. But there is some truth to that. And that is that sometimes we create belonging around what we believe. But even if I'm creating belonging around what I believe, it's the belonging that ultimately fuels what is going to follow. And that's why it becomes such a powerful transformational force.
So in that sense, attachment is not like a tool in the toolkit, but it is the toolkit.
Well, and when I was starting out in ministry, that's the way I looked at it, was I'm just here to collect tools to try to help people. And so we had spiritual warfare tools, and we had inner healing tools, and we had Bible meditation tools, and we had biblical study tools, and we had, community group tools, and, you go on those lists. But when we got to this idea of attachment and maturity development, all of a sudden you realize, okay, this is actually the purpose of all of the tools, that the purpose of all of these other tools is to help people grow their maturity by growing their emotional capacity, and that all of these things, work together to do that. And that even our intimacy with God is helping us grow our capacity and our maturity. And so I'm like, okay, this kind of ties everything together and gives it the goal of what this is all about.
Yeah, well, and on that note, talk more about maturity.
So, yeah, maturity is kind of interchangeable with the idea of emotional capacity. Life Model basically talks about 6 levels of maturity. And this is a system that Dr. Wilder and his co-workers came up with at Shepherd's House. And the first one is in utero, which we sometimes skip, but there is emotional capacity actually developing in the womb before we're born.
That's incredible.
Yeah, there's a lot of things developing there already. And then every time you move from one stage to another, it's like a death and resurrection. So you die to living in the womb, and you are born into a new reality where all of a sudden everything has changed, and you've got to come to grips with this new reality. And as an infant, I can't take care of anything, right? I need somebody else to recognize what's going on, meet me in that problem, and take care of me. So even when I bang the microphone with my hand. So it's like there's people like that. And at the infant level, I just need somebody else to recognize and take care of it. Then I die to being an infant, and I am born into the child level years. And that happens when I basically when I'm weaned, I'm no longer, where I'm actually getting to the point where I'm eating food and feeding myself, right? And not taking a bottle, not on the breast kind of thing. So now I am moving to a stage where I need to learn how to take care of myself. So you're like, I got to dress myself. I got to learn how to eat. I got to learn how to go potty and all those things. But I've also, as I progress, have to learn how to take care of my own emotions. And so just like I need help learning the potty training, and I need help with walking, and I need help with, eating and dressing and all those other things, I'm going to need help with my learning emotional regulation. So those are all child level skills. And then I hit puberty, right? And I die to being a child, and I am born into this world of adults. And what's supposed to happen now is that I am well practiced at taking care of my own emotional needs, and I am ready to take care of two people at the same time. I can not only make sure I'm okay, but I can make sure that we're both okay. Like, all right, we can do something together and find win-wins together. And my whole brain system goes through a major renovation at puberty, where my core identity is no longer coming from my parents, but it's coming from my peers, and that's not just a cultural thing. That's actually a brain thing, where my brain is more wired to my group. And that brings us right back to belonging and attachment, right? Because who I am attached to, who I see as my people, will give me my identity. So, classic high school terms, if I'm a nerd, these are my people, right? And I see myself there. If I'm a athlete and those are my people, or if I'm in the drama group, or if I'm in the, whatever group it is, but you associate, say, these are my people. Well, as soon as you start thinking of like, I belong with them, these are my people, you are now predisposed to embrace a worldview and a value system that goes with that people. And so belonging leads to worldview, leads to values, creates the behavior, drives things. And so what happens is the Bible warns us we have to be very, very careful who we bond to and who we attach to, and because it's going to have such a powerful influence on the way we live. The other two things, just to touch briefly, are parent level and elder level. It's not marriage, right? It's when you have your first baby that you go from adult to parent, because now you're taking care of not just two adults, but you're actually passing on life. And again, you die to being an adult to become a parent, and then you die to being a parent to becoming an elder. And having gone through this recently myself, I was a little surprised at how hard it was. Like, there was a real sense of this stage of life is over, and there is a new calling on me and who I am and how you go through that. And I was a little surprised at how big of a transition that it actually was.
That was an excellent crash course in the maturity levels. Where can people go? I mean, we'll keep talking. These things will keep coming up throughout our conversations, I am sure. But where can people go if they want more right now?
Well, Life Model's core book is Living from the Heart Jesus Gave You. And so if you want the core life model stuff, go there. If you want to get a summary of all of this, Jim and I together wrote Rare Leadership. And that actually has the fullest, probably, explanation of everything that I just walked through. So I would recommend people go there.
Awesome. Thank you. We are kind of coming up to the end of the episode here. Before we get Dad's final thoughts, I just want to remind everyone to check out the free joy building tool at 4habits.org. It is simple, it is fun and effective, and I hope you enjoy it. Father, do you have any final thoughts for this episode and maybe a vision for what you want to do with this series?
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to camp out here is that because joy bonds sort of mess with my head and mess with my world, is like, okay, I've got to rethink everything. I sort of want to take people on that journey with me of what it was like to try to rethink all of this and re-envision how not only do I myself tick, but how does Christianity work and how does this all come together? So that's sort of the journey I'm hoping that we'll go on, and looking forward to it. Should be fun.
Well, my father, last episode, we talked about joy bonds, and we're going to just keep continuing talking about joy. But to this episode, we're going to look at the flip side. There are two fuels our brains can run on, joy and fear. So we're going to be talking about the fear fuel today.
Yeah, the fuel of fear. There are a couple of things that really grabbed a hold of my mental, thought life on this. One was that joy is largely in the front of my brain and fear is largely in the back of the brain. And that I like the visual that when I am running on the fuel of joy, then I stay in the front part of my brain. Well, the front part of my brain is where the command center of my brain is located that remembers who I am, how it's like me to act. And so when I can be in that part of my brain, not only do I live out of my joyful self, but I live out of my relational self and I live out of my true self. When I don't, live from that part of my brain, I get stuck in the back. And when I get stuck in the back, that means I'm living out of fear. And when I live out of fear, then I am in problem solving mode and I treat people like problems to solve. And I will shut down relationally or blow up relationally, but I'm not my relational self. And this made so much sense because it was really frustrating as a pastor who's supposed to be modeling spiritual maturity for people, right? Is how could I go from being this kind of person who seemed to have it all together to completely falling apart, in so quickly? What was going on that you literally did feel like a different person, and you get done with something and you're like, you regret it and you're like, who was that? What was happening there? So the brain picture of I had left the part of my brain that remembered who I was. I had lost access to that part of my brain and I was functioning in the back of my brain was just revolutionary for me. And it was like, it just made so much sense out of the whole mess. And I'm like, okay, I see what's going on. I have a hole in my maturity development. And when I fall into that hole, I turn into a different person. And I'm like, well, that, didn't fix the problem. It gave me something to work on. So, and a completely different strategy for how to try to address those issues than I would have had without it.
Yeah. As we were talking about this series, I just kept hearing this famous quote from Dune, the book Dune, "Fear is the mind killer." That works really well, actually. And I want you to talk more about the science of joy and fear. And I know you have said that joy builds brain cells and fear destroys brain cells. And I think it was in the fear destroys brain cells part that I thought, yes, fear is the mind killer.
Yes. And it is true at that level. So one of the things that I learned from Dr. Wilder was that if I go to sleep in a state of anxiety, it's like cortisol is going to pump through my brain all night long and it's going to kill all the new growth. And so it really does destroy brain cells. And one of the things we want to do here is distinguish between fear and anxiety, and then explain what a fear bond is versus what a joy bond is. So let me start with like the difference between fear and anxiety. So anxiety is belief-based. So anxiety comes when I am thinking about the problems in my life and imagining what could happen. And so beliefs that trigger anxiety almost always start with what if. Right? Like, what if this happens? What if that happens? So I think of feeling like Peter stepping out of the boat into the storm, and then he looks around and he starts going, well, wait a second, what's going on here? What if? Now I can actually start to have anxiety thinking about what if I get caught in this situation? And so you think about the things that try to trigger it. It's when we're thinking about the future. And like, what if this relationship doesn't work? What if I never find a relationship? What if this finances don't come together? What if my finances are ruined? What if, and what happens is the more often my brain goes down that pattern of the what if anxiety, then that becomes a habit. And so habits are formed in the brain as neurons connect together and form chains. So I think of this like every time I do something, it's like these neurons connect and form a chain. And the more often that I do it, the stronger that chain gets. And then that chain gets wrapped with white matter. And once that chain gets wrapped with white matter, I start doing things almost automatically, right? I start doing things as if it's like that's why we call it a habit. It's now become an automatic reaction. I'm not thinking about it anymore. So that can happen with my thought life, where I've literally trained myself to go in a negative direction in my thought life so much that I'm going to have to do something to break that. And what we found is the only way to break a bad habit is to build a new one. So I can't just say, I'm going to stop that. I'm going to stop that. I'm going to stop that. I actually have to build a new neuro highway, wrap that thing in white matter, and build new habits and new patterns in my life. And that's why we're focusing on joy here, because I would have thought that the opposite of anxiety was faith. But what I realize is that the part of me that exercises faith and that trusts God the command center in the front part of my brain. So in other words, to get to the part of myself that trusts God and to believe and to have faith, I've got to get to that relational center, which means I've got to find joy. And so that's why joy is actually the antidote to fear at a more primal level than even faith.
That's so fascinating on just so many levels. Like as you read the Bible and just look for all the places where joy will start popping out even more. And I love it. Can you explain what a fear bond is?
Yeah. So a fear bond is where I have an attachment with somebody that is based on fear rather than joy. So this can look a lot of different ways, but I think of it this way, that among friends, you think about it going to school. And there are some people, when you see them at school, you light up with energy and you're not choosing to do it. It's like, oh, it's them. I'm going to choose to light up with energy, right? There's just this automatic joy because you've seen that friend. Now, there are other people who walk up to you and you have a different reaction, and it actually can suck the life out of you a little bit because you know that your problems are about to get bigger, or at least you believe your problems are about to get bigger. And so you can even picture this like when your cell phone lights up. There are some names that pop up on the screen and it's like, yay. And there's others that pop up and you go, ugh, and part of you just sort of, goes down. So when I get in a fear bond with somebody, what happens is I don't believe they are going to be happy to see me, or I don't think they're going to be happy to see me unless, right? And that is unless I act a certain way, unless I wear a mask, unless I pretend to be a certain way. In other words, I'm going to have to manage this person. I can't just relate to them and be myself around them. They're going to have to be managed. And so a fear bond always leads me to want to manage people. So what happens is if you find that you're managing everybody in your life, it means that your brain has just learned to fear bond to everybody. And one of the things we look at is how do we begin to transform these fear bonds into joy bonds?
Yeah, well, and that pattern of fear bonding leads to fear mapping. And do you want to talk more about that and maybe how your brain is like an amplifier?
Yeah. So if I'm fear bonded with a lot of people, then what happens is my brain learns, oh, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for things to be afraid of. And since my brain is a natural amplifier, it learns very quickly what it is that you look for most naturally. And it says, okay, I can find that for you. And so if your brain learns we're supposed to look for things that make us afraid, it'll get really good at finding things that make you afraid. And but if your brain learns we're supposed to look for things that we can be grateful for and appreciate, then your brain will learn that, oh yeah, well, I can find those things too. And the story it always reminds me of, I have a friend who years ago sold tractors. And he said when he started selling tractors, the thing that amazed him the most was how many tractors he started to notice, that he had driven by this places all of the time and never even noticed them before. But now that tractors was his business, his brain began to amplify it and he started noticing tractors everywhere, right? So you've probably had experience like that before, it's like,
yeah, or even just like, oh, we have a new car and it's this color. And now all of a sudden I'm seeing that color car everywhere. We don't actually get new cars. We get used cars.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's just the new thing on the market. It's that,
No, exactly. And so what happens then is your brain is learning what it's supposed to amplify, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is, amplify means what is it supposed to make big? What is it supposed to bring into focus for you? And so if I have developed fear bonds as the habit in my life, then my brain has learned I need to fear map the world. And that means mapping the world means I am scanning it for what there is to fear. And if I am scanning my environment constantly for what there is to fear, I'm going to find it. And if I don't see it right away, then my anxiety will kick in and I'm going, yeah, well, I can imagine it being here and I can imagine it coming there. And I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop and all these other things. And that is now coming. And before I know it, I'm now living in a very dark place internally that can be very difficult to get out of because you can't just choose your way out of that sometimes. So,
and the good news is you can also joy with your joy bonds. You can have joy mapping and appreciation mapping. And it's also not an all or nothing experience. Our capacity affects this, our attachments affect this. Can you talk more about how fear and joy bonds, maybe from the angle of the window of tolerance?
Yeah. So Daniel Siegel is one of the neuroscientists that informed the life model development, talks about the window of tolerance. And what he means by that is that there is a how much emotional weight can I tolerate before things start falling apart. And so when I talk about emotional capacity, window of tolerance is the same thing. So window of tolerance is how much weight can I emotional weight can I handle before I am outside of that window. And if I get outside of that window, that's when things start shutting down, things start blowing up, I start melting down, bad things start happening, I turn into a different person. All those bad things happen when I get outside that window. So maturity can be thought of as the process of growing the size of my window of tolerance so that I can handle more and more emotional weight. So when you go from 15 pounds to 20 pounds to 25 pounds, right, you are doing the same thing. You're trying to grow that capacity. The other thing you're trying to do is develop the skills that allow you to get back, once you've gotten outside of that. So there are some skills, like let me give you examples of things that, seem obvious once you hear them, but at first I didn't even think about them. And that is, it's one of the reasons why we need to take a break now and then. It's one of the reasons why we need a breather. We can't just keep plowing on and plowing on and plowing on. At some point, we got to take breaks. And one of the reasons is if we don't, then we're going to find ourselves just constantly living outside of that window of tolerance. And if you're constantly living on the edge of your emotional capacity, or constantly living just beyond the edge of your emotional capacity, you're going to be constantly in a state of emotional upset. And when you're right on the edge like that, it just doesn't take as much to blow up at people. It doesn't take as much to, melt down in tears. It doesn't take as much to, get stuck in anxiety and fear, because I am keeping myself on the edge of my capacity all of the time. So one of the things we do have to do is not only do we have to grow that emotional capacity, we also have to learn when to take breaks, right? And give ourselves
and
some
it's
space.
So biblical.
Yeah.
It's so biblical. I mean,
something like Sabbath. I don't know. Yeah,
something like Sabbath, something like, don't cut the corners of your fields and like giving the land time to rest and all of the different holidays and festivals and yes. And again, Sabbath.
Yeah. And I think that sometimes we miss that rest biblically is actually an act of worship. Because when I rest, what I'm doing is I am saying with my actions, I'm trusting God to take care of me. I don't have to do everything. And that's huge, right? Because all of us have that temptation. If I don't trust God, then it's all on me. And I can't afford to rest because it's all on me. And so there is something to this idea of establishing a rhythm, right, in our lives. And so we talk about knowing when to take a break, knowing when to, how to have this kind of a rhythm that allows me to keep going. So it's like we tell the staff at Deeper Walk all the time. It's like, we want you to have a rhythm because we want you here for a long time. We don't want to just, chew you up and spit you out and burn you out fast, right? We want people to want to work here and to find a rhythm that they can maintain for a long time.
Mm-hmm. So before we have our closing thoughts, I have another question that I want to make sure we get to, and that is just, you have a subheading in the 4 Habits of Joy-Filled People that I love. You talk about tearing down the house of fear. And yeah, I just love that imagery. Could you talk more about that imagery?
So in our new book, The 4 Habits of Joy-Filled People, the core image that Chris and I use is that we all have an inner world. And in our inner world, you can think of it as like the house in which I live. And that's either going to be a fear house or a joy house or some kind of a hybrid in between, right? But to the extent that that is a fear house, I'm not going to want to spend much time there. And so you stop and think about it. It's like, if I have a fear house in my inner world, then I'm probably going to develop a pretty avoidant lifestyle. I'm not going to want to be alone with my thoughts. I'm not going to want to be alone with myself. I'm not going to want quiet. I'm not going to want peace. I got to keep myself distracted. I got to keep myself busy. I got to keep things coming in, because if I'm alone with myself, I'm stuck here in this house of fear. Well, who wants that, right? And so one of the things that we find is that a lot of people with their house of fear have never learned to rest, and they have never learned to be quiet or how to turn off the noise and to detach from things. And that's why it can be a skill, and it can become a habit that we have to learn to try to, cope with that. So what we want instead is in our inner world to have a joy house. And that is to tear down that fear house and to build a joy house, which is a place that we like being. And when that's the case, then we can develop much less avoidant lifestyles and learn to quiet and be at peace much more readily.
And that's our goal as we're exploring this on the trail. We are going to be tearing down some houses of fear and building up some houses of joy. I'm excited for it. So as we come up to the end of this episode, and before we get Dad's final thoughts, I just want to remind you to check out the free joy building tool at 4habits.org. And I hope you have so much fun using it to build your joy capacity. So, mi papa, any final thoughts for this episode?
Well, I think that as I think about this, there's so many different directions it goes to. But one of the reasons is personal is for most of my life, I didn't think I had any issues. Right? I thought I was about as normal as a normal person could be, and then what happened is as I got into parenting and then I got into leadership and then I started adding more and more weight to my life. It's like I got to handle the weight from all the expectations at church, got to handle the weight of all the expectations. And what happens is as you start adding more and more weight, your margin gets thinner and thinner and thinner. And I started developing anxiety, and I had never been an anxious person. And so now I'm like, okay, what's going on here? And what I realized was I just maxed out my capacity. I'd maxed it out and I didn't realize what was going on. And I needed to kind of reinvent my approach to life. It wasn't just about taking thoughts captive. That was part of it. Yeah, there's going to be a whole new approach to life that I was going to have to come to understand. And so that's part of what I wanted to share with folks.
Today, for our episode, we are talking about building a joy house. Before we get into that, do you want to just describe where that concept came from? What is building a joy house?
The idea of joy houses, it sounds like just a typical, metaphor, but, through the years, I've worked with a lot of folks who've had dissociative identities or multiple personalities. And what I found is that most of them had inner worlds. And there was a classic case where one person, when we first met, they were basically living in dungeons in their inner world. I mean, kids were trapped, all their little kid parts were trapped in these dungeons, and they were just living with constant torment. It would talk about a fear house. And Jesus showed up and he unlocked the gates and he let them free, and they didn't leave because they were so scared, right? But anyway, he eventually helped them get out of there, come to this beautiful place where he provided for them a different house. And this house was like a castle. It was like an Irish or a Scottish castle. It was just gorgeous. And it was a place where they could live. And from there, now the kids could live a life of adventure and play. And they all had pets and they all did different things. And what I found by that was that Jesus was interested in them having a positive, healthy, happy inner world in which to live. And I found that to a large extent, that's essentially in working with people who have these really severe issues like this, that it's often just a model of what all of us go through, just with more clarity and intensity. And so I realizing, that's a pretty good metaphor for all of us. We all need to be careful what our inner world turns into, that it's a place that we like to spend time. And if it is, then it becomes the source of a lot of adventure, the source of intimacy with God. And if it's not, then it's something we want to avoid, or it's someplace we feel trapped.
Yeah, I love the imagery. And so building a joy house in our terms can be thought of as building resilience. And we've talked a lot about resilience on this podcast, but could you talk more about it from that perspective? And I know last episode, I think we talked about your window of tolerance. So what is a window of tolerance? What does it look like to grow that?
So the window of tolerance is essentially, it is the measure of how much upset emotion you can handle and absorb without it really affecting you or throwing you off. And you can begin to tell when it has affected you because you turn into a different person. It's like you go from being friendly to being kind of surly. You go from being engaged to being shut down. Something changes very rapidly because you reach the edge of your window of capacity. So what happens is that I sometimes think of this as like cups, and that the water or liquid that you put into the cups, it represents how much stress I can handle or how much emotional upset I can handle before that cup overflows. And so the problem we find is there's a couple problems. One is a lot of us live right on the edge of our window of tolerance all of the time. And because of that, it just doesn't take much to push us past the edge. And so there are two basic solutions here. One is I need to take a break and give myself a break to pull back from the edge. And that requires a rhythm. It requires some patterning in my life that gives me enough time off to pull away from the edge like that. And the other is I need to do things like calming and appreciating and storytelling and attacking the toxic thinking to begin growing my window of tolerance so that it takes more and more to overwhelm me. So those are the two things. I want to grow it and I want to give myself adequate rest and adequate breaks so I'm not constantly on the edge of it.
Mm-hmm. And developing recovery skills, which would be the rest and such. Yeah. So I was thinking, we started the year off talking about sort of the building bounce and ABCs of building bounce. Could you, I think that's really appropriate for right now. Could you give an overview of the ABCs of building bounce?
Yeah, I was working with Stephanie Hinman, who, she's an art therapist, deals with a lot of children coming out, right, trying to rebuild their capacity that maybe they missed. In talking through it, we landed on ABC as a real simple way to remember what it is. And A is appreciation and quieting. And those two always go together, appreciation and quieting, because after I've felt the joy of appreciation, it's easier to quiet. And sometimes it's easier to appreciate once I have quieted. So those two things are always go together. I look at them like flip sides of the same coin. That is, sometimes I quiet in order to appreciate. And then when I'm done, it's easy to quiet again. Sometimes I appreciate first, and then it's easier to quiet afterwards. So you'll even see this in like seminars and things where people will gather. They'll tell funny stories to each other or happy stories. And you can feel the energy in the room getting, really light and happy. And then afterwards, it's just much easier for people. Like it opens up headspace for them because they are now further away from the edge of their window of tolerance than they were before, right? They've got a little more capacity. And so we've all felt that where I had some joy, and after the joy, I had more quiet. So that's the A. Appreciation, quieting, those always go together. The B is beliefs. And this is the idea that I often rob myself of joy and rob myself of things because my mindset is in these dark places, whether it's like the person living in a dungeon, right? I'm just always in darkness in my thoughts, or I'm always in fear, anticipating the what ifs of life. So we need to deal with B is beliefs. And then C is connections, and the idea that I have to grow capacity relationally. I don't just hold myself up in a room, do a whole bunch of like emotional push-ups, come out and go, look at me, I am now emotional Superman, right? The only way you can do this is relationally. And so you have to have connections with people just to practice a lot of these skills. Also, being with people where we feel safe, calm, and connected, right? Those are the three words: safe, calm, and connected. Has a lot to do with how quickly I grow my emotional capacity. And then we put into that connecting with God, right? And that is, there's a lot of us who don't feel safe, calm, and connected with God. And that creates a lot of our emotional problems. So we have to find ways to overcome the fears we have with God. So that we can have a stable relationship with him.
Well, and that's so key because, going back to the dungeons versus castle metaphor, the point there isn't just generic safety, like, oh, you're not in a scary place and now you're in a happy place, but it's also the happy places where Jesus is spending, like you are spending time with Jesus in this happy place. And so yeah, it's part of building resilience and building your joy house is building a house with Jesus and spending time with him there. So yes, thank you. So the ABCs of building bounce, that was just a quick fire hose overview. We have several episodes that just go through each of those points, but I wanted to make sure if you haven't heard that before, you know that exists and you can go back and listen to those or get the book Building Bounce, and that will help you build your resilience even more. So the book that just came out, Dad, The 4 Habits of Joy-Filled People, you wrote with Chris Coursey. You actually use the joy house as a central theme here, and your acrostic is the Spanish word CASA, which means house. So would you give us an overview of CASA? And then also I'll just add, Dad and Chris did a little mini podcast series that it's not out yet, and we'll let you know when it's out. But that is going to take you step by step through CASA as well. So we're going to do an overview here.
Yeah, absolutely. So Chris and I got together up at the Hobart property where the Deeper Walk is acquired in February. And Ben was there, and he did the production work, and we recorded some podcasts. I think actually Moody is going to be distributing those. But the CASA acrostic, this is going to sound familiar with the ABC because there's a lot of overlap, right? We said A is appreciation and quieting. Well, C is calming. A is appreciating. So that's the foundation. There's no way around it. You've got to lay those two things. So that's always going to be the foundation of building resilience. Calming or quieting and appreciating, right? Then the S is new, and that is this idea of storytelling. And it was really inspired by the fact that Thrive Today, when they do their training, and they want to teach people how to bounce back from upsetting emotions, they realize that one of the ways that our brain builds resilience is that it collects stories of times that we successfully navigated hard emotions. And so when I feel that emotion, if the only stories that pop up are stories of times that emotion overwhelmed me, I'm in trouble. But if I feel an emotion and what pops up are memories of times that I felt that emotion, and I was still okay, acted like myself, it didn't overwhelm me, I was able to bounce back quickly, then I'm less intimidated by the emotion. So the idea here is collecting stories. Now, I'm going to camp out on storytelling.
Yes, I was going to ask you to, so thank you.
I was doing a leadership training event recently and did a little experiment. And I had the people go around in the group and tell a story. And I assigned different emotions. Like, tell me a story about feeling disgust. Tell me one about feeling, sadness. And what I found was interesting is everyone in the room, except for like one person, their story went something like this. So I experienced this really bad thing. It made me feel this really bad emotion. And that's why I am the way I am. Right. Now, that's an interesting pattern to the story, right? I experienced this bad thing. I felt this bad emotion. And that's why I messed up. Now, if that's the conclusion of your story, right, then your brain is telling yourself over and over again, you're a messed up person, and will always be a messed up person because every time you feel this emotion, it's a sign that you're messed up. I was like, that's not really the messaging we want going on in our brains. So we teach a step method to, it literally is the word step, an acrostic step method on how to tell a helpful story. And that is, so what's the setting of the story you're going to tell? What's the trigger what's the emotion that got triggered? And then what's the point you want to make? We say the point should either be, and this is how I handled it well, or this is how I bounced back from it, or I didn't necessarily handle it well, but this is the lesson that I've learned. What we don't want to do is make the point of the story, that's why I messed up, right? Or that's why I don't function well.
You want the story to end in hope.
You want the story to end in hope. You want the story to end that you were able to get through that emotion and be okay.
Could you give us an example of a story?
Sure. So my go-to illustration on this is being at a restaurant, and it was a buffet, and noticing that they had chocolate mousse, and I made a mental note that I wanted to go back and get this chocolate mousse for dessert. And so so the setting is I was at a restaurant with some friends, and the trigger was that I went back, got myself the chocolate mousse, took my first bite, and almost spit it out in front of everybody, right? And because it wasn't chocolate mousse, it was liver pate. I know. It was just greasy and like we're not
the opposite of chocolate mousse.
Opposite. And it was just, so what it did is it created the emotion of disgust. My whole body felt like retching a little bit, because that's what disgust is. It makes you want to vomit. So it's like I was thinking, oh, yuck. I want to get this taste out of my mouth. And then I noticed that everybody's laughing, right? They're all like, oh, that's so funny. And I'm like, So at this point, what am I going to do? I was like, I can get mad at him. Why are you laughing at me? I'm not, but I realized it is kind of funny, right? This is pretty funny. So I was able to laugh with them. I went to the bathroom and gargled a little bit. Then I went back and got a drink of something else and found the actual chocolate mousse. And they all ended well. So, but it was a time of feeling disgust, but realizing I don't have to let disgust take me in this, oh, life is unfair. I hate, why is everything in like this? Well, why does this always happen? You could take a story like this and go in a direction of, why does this always happen to me? Life isn't fair. And why are people laughing at me? And you could take it in a very negative direction. So that's why I'm making the point that I was able to stay myself, laugh about it with them, go fix the situation and get what I wanted, realized I was okay.
Very good. Thank you. All right. Any more on storytelling or?
Well, it's probably enough for now. I mean, there's a lot. Obviously, like I said, Thrive Today does a lot of great stuff with storytelling.
And to clarify, Thrive Today is Chris Coursey's.
Yeah. Co-author Chris Coursey. He is the president of Thrive Today. So that's kind of where that idea came from. So we have calming and appreciating, CA, storytelling, which is the S. And then the next day is attacking toxic thinking. So you're going to see the beliefs from the ABC model here, right? And in some ways, storytelling is about beliefs too. It's like, let's get our story straight, right? What is it that we want to tell ourselves? So yeah, the idea of attacking toxic thinking really hit home for me. The first time I was intentionally trying to practice appreciation, when I was like, okay, I want to not just sip down my coffee as fast as possible, get on with my day. I want to appreciate it, right? And so I'm holding my cup of coffee and I'm feeling the cool of the ceramic and smelling the aroma. And this whole thing goes on about 2 seconds and the thought comes into my head, this is the stupidest thing you've ever done. Okay, so that's what I mean by an attack. I was attacked by a toxic thought, right? This is the stupidest thing you've ever done. And I realized just how much of the good things I try to do in life get sabotaged because I don't recognize the toxic thinking and I don't take those thoughts captive. And it takes me back, honestly, I was thinking about this yesterday. And when I was in Little League playing baseball, my dad gave me Maxwell Maltz, Psycho-Cybernetics, and it had lots of stories in there of professional athletes who would picture themselves doing things perfectly over and over and over again. And so my dad encouraged me, I was a pitcher, and he encouraged me before every pitch, just take 2 seconds to picture myself making the perfect pitch. Now, that wasn't the same pitch every time. It wasn't like right down the middle. It was like, I want this one high and inside and fast. I want this one low and outside and slow. It's like, what are you going to do? Picture yourself doing it perfectly, then do it. And what I found is that when I struggled with my pitching, I couldn't actually do that. It was like, it was really, really hard for me to visualize myself doing it correctly. And I found a very real connection here between the confidence with which I lived, the confidence with which I did these things, and the mental pictures that were driving the way I lived. So when we talk about attacking toxic thinking, that's kind of it. We're talking about recognizing those mental images and those quick stabbing thoughts that suck the life out of us and replacing those as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm excited to hear more about that in future. For now, I do want to ask, where did these 4 come from? Did you just pick 4 that spell CASA?
Yeah, I really wanted CASA, so I just know. It is kind of funny. The acrostic always comes last, just so people understand how this works. It's like you attack a subject, you come down with principles, and then once you've written out all the principles, I will literally put like what are 4 or 5 possible words that sum up that principle. And then I look to see if there's a pattern among those words that I can make spell something. So it's never like, oh, hey, let's do this. These come from the fact that they're just, we try not to overwhelm people. We don't want to say, here's 17 principles for living a happier life. So 4 is a good number. And we are also trying to make this a book that you could give to a non-Christian audience. So we left out what would normally be the 5th part here, and that is our connection to God. And that is that people who have a joy bond with God generally do much better with their emotional capacity than people who have a fear bond with God. And so if could have put anything else in this book that wasn't there, that would have been in there, but it's because of the audience.
Mm-hmm. That's really good to know. So we are coming up to the end of the episode. Before we get Dad's final thoughts, feels especially appropriate considering today's topic to remind everyone that we have a free tool for you that you can access today. It's never too late to grow your capacity to feel joy because your brain has the capacity to grow joy as long as you live. And it only takes 28 days to form a new habit. Thrive Today and Deeper Walk have partnered to put together a 28-day joy challenge for you. You can sign up for free at 4habits.org. When you sign up, you'll receive 28 days of simple joy exercises straight to your inbox. Plus, you can choose your favorite printable calendar for a physical reminder about each day's exercise. I hope you accept the challenge and have so much fun using it to build your joy capacity. So, my father, any final thoughts for the episode?
All right, so you're going to appreciate this. So we've had a cat in the room the whole time we've been doing this. He's a very busy, active cat. And one of the things, and we used to have a cat, and we're about to get another one, I think, here. So it's
Yes, this is my roommate's cat who's in the room with us.
Oh, okay. So one of the things I've often noticed about animals and having a pet, I mean, if you've had pets, you probably notice this, is that like cats act like cats, right? Dogs act like dogs. I never walk into a room and see a cat acting like a dog, right? Or I don't run in and say, why is the dog suddenly acting like a leopard? That doesn't happen. They act like themselves. And I find that humans are we're the one group that has trouble sometimes acting like ourselves. And when I have trouble acting like myself, it's a sign that I have an emotional capacity issue that needs addressed. If I feel like I've got to wear a mask, if I have to pretend, if I just am not being myself, it is usually a sign that I have an emotional capacity issue that needs to be addressed. So I think the encouragement today, when I see animals, so my encouragement, when you see an animal, you say the animal acts like himself, maybe I should try acting like myself today, see how that goes, better game plan. So
when we were plotting out our episodes, you called this one Taming the Amygdala. How very sciencey of you. So what do you want to tell us about the amygdala and our emotions?
So I remember watching Dr. Wilder do a conference from the 1990s, I think it was, on joy bonds versus fear bonds. And he had so much brain science in here, and I'd never heard any of it before. And so it was like, listen for 2 minutes, pause, take notes, think. Like listen for 3 minutes, pause, and he's throwing around this term amygdala and cortexes and I'm like, I don't know my cortex from my, nucleus accumbens. I don't know what's going on with all these words. So that's kind of where the whole journey started. And everything I know about the brain, honestly, has come just from studying Jim stuff. And so what he's told me is that the amygdala is basically level 2 of the joy elevator. So if you think about the joy elevator having a first floor attachment, I think of that first floor as like a light bulb in the brain. It lights up when I feel like being with somebody, or lights up when somebody suddenly or something becomes personal to me. So for example, we're walking through a crowded city and most people are just sort of background until all of a sudden somebody starts walking towards you, and now all of a sudden they become personal to you. And so once they become personal to you, it goes to level 2, and level 2 is the amygdala. And that is what we tend to think of as our fight or flight center. But what the amygdala's job is to do is to give you a quick kind of triage on this thing that just became personal to you. And it can only do one of 3 assessments. This is either good, this is bad, or this is scary. And it will quickly make that assessment. It does it faster than you can think about it. And then it sends it on up. And so that it gets up to level 3 of this joy elevator. That's where you're reading people. So let's say that somebody's walking towards you and it lights up as this is bad. Okay, it's going to send that signal up. Now you're going to start reading this person's body language. And bad triggers low energy emotions in us, like shame, disgust, sadness, or despair. So I might feel any of those emotions based on how I read, this person coming at me too. It's like I could see someone coming and feel shame, like, oh no, I can't believe they saw me, or I'm not dressed right, or whatever it is. I could have a shame reaction at somebody coming to me. I could have a disgust reaction, like, ooh, I hope that person doesn't, get around here. Or I could have sadness reaction. Maybe they remind me of somebody, or maybe they trigger a memory. I'm not even conscious of what memory is getting triggered. I just know something about them coming is making me sad. And so when you look at it that way, it could also send a high energy emotion trigger, which would be fear and anger. And so now my higher level brain functions have to deal with that based on what the amygdala is doing. So when the amygdala will get and based on how well I can handle the signals from my amygdala, that depends on how well I'm going to do at staying myself, acting like myself, remaining relational, and operating from those higher level brain functions. So there you go. That's there's my brain science summary for the day. Okay. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, and so what you just described are what you call the sad emotions. They're like the six big, sometimes people say the six big negative emotions or the protector emotions. Do you want to explain where that comes from?
Yeah, so they are directly related to the amygdala. So what happens is, we talk sometimes about the brain having an on-off switch. Chris Coursey calls it the joy switch. And when this switch is on, it means the amygdala is sending a good signal, everything's okay. It can also be on even if the amygdala is sending a bad or scary signal, if I have enough capacity to keep it on, that it doesn't overwhelm me. So that can be because I'm getting a very mild signal, or it can be that I just have the capacity to deal with the signal that's being sent. Now, the question was, where do the sad comes from? They come from the amygdala in this sense that when the amygdala triggers something as bad, right, it can do good, bad, or scary. When it triggers as a bad, that gives us the 4 low energy emotions of these big 6. If it triggers something as scary, that's what gives us the 2 high energy emotions. So just to help myself remember those, I came up with sad, so I could remember them. Like, what are these big 6 again? And I start with the S. It's sadness, that's low energy. Anger, that's high energy. Disgust, that's low energy. Shame, low energy. Then fear, or afraid, anxiety, whatever word you want to use there. And then despair, which is low energy. So so that spells sad, and that's how I remember them. That is where it comes from. It's the amygdala triggering bad is the SD, and the SD of sad, and it triggering fear is the 2 A's.
And if it triggers good, then that's joy, or
yeah,
what
if it triggers joy, it doesn't create joy. It's more neutral. It's just like the brain can keep functioning without interruption. We're not sending it.
It passes up to the next level.
Up to the next level, and it gives me an opportunity to get to my joy center. And so, if I have a well-developed joy center, it'll be a natural reaction to stay there.
So I've heard you and Jim talk about how the amygdala, like once you get an impression, it is just always there. And I always struggled with that a little bit. Like, wait, you can change your story, or you can change things, or like have a new first impression on something. So can you explain that a little bit?
So that's true. Once the amygdala learns something, it's permanent. So what can change is my narrative about it and my capacity to deal with it. So for example, when I was a little kid, our next door neighbor had a big dog, and I remember it got in my face and snarled and whatever, and scared me. So to this day, right, my initial internal reaction at a dog coming toward me is not good. So I have to, but if it isn't triggering too much, I can handle it, and then my capacity can handle that. And then I can go to my narrative part of it, give myself a narrative that says, this is going to be fine, this is okay. And I can read the dog and make sure, see if it's really scary or not. So all that happens really fast, right? It takes me much longer to explain it than it happens. Jim had the same thing with dogs, right? Because he grew up in Colombia, and their dogs could be deadly. I mean, they ran the streets. They were not pets for homes. So once your amygdala learns that, it never forgets it, and it will trigger it. So what keeps it from being hopeless is that we can overcome that by growing our capacity and changing our narrative.
Okay, good to know. And so how would this factor in with the art of storytelling?
So let me first of all explain why storytelling is one of these things, right? Because I wrote the book Chris Coursey. Chris, of course, is the director or president of Thrive Today. And Thrive Today's origins were taking the gym science. They're taking the brain science of gym. That's probably a good term, gym science with Life Model Works. But it's taking the brain science that Jim was learning and working together to develop exercises to see, could you train somebody who had missed out on what they needed as an infant or a toddler? And could you, as an adult, now train them in such a way that they could still learn that skill and have that capacity and not be trapped, right, because of their childhood? And so they began developing these exercises, and they developed Thrive training out of this. Well, when you get to level 2 of Thrive training, it's mostly storytelling. And so that was what prompted me to say, hey, I think storytelling needs to be one of these 4 habits, because that's the primary tool, right, you guys are using to do this. So what storytelling does is a couple of things. Number one, storytelling builds relational connection. So it engages. So if you tell me a story, it gets my right brain engaged with your right brain. So it helps to grow and expand my capacity to share mutual mind with you as I'm, in the same story with you. I'm building a world in my mind as you're creating a world for me with your words, right? And so we are sharing this as we're both having this, connection. So there's a relational connection part of it. And then there's the narrative itself has to do with my belief system. And what I'm trying to do is create a library in my head. And because the library in my head will pull up not only memories, but what those memories mean to me. And so changing our narrative, right, and getting changing the way we tell stories could be hugely important to managing our emotions.
So it's the stories you tell yourself, and it's the stories you tell other people.
It's both. It's the stories we tell ourselves, and it's how we talk about our emotions to people. So where this connects specifically, I actually did an experiment with this not too long ago when I was doing a corporate training event. And I asked, it was a small group, and I just had them go around a circle, gave them a few basic instructions, said, tell us an emotion story. And what I realized, and I hadn't really expected this, but what I realized was every one of them followed the same pattern. And the pattern was, this bad thing happened to me. That made me feel this bad emotion. And that's why I am the way I am. And so what people were doing is their story was reinforcing why they were messed up. It's like this story is, this bad thing happened, made me feel these negative emotions, and to this day, that's why I can't handle this emotion. Well, if that's what you're telling yourself over and over and over again, one, that's not good self-talk. That's going to keep you stuck. And two, when I'm telling that story to other people, it's just reinforcing that this is my identity, right? I am a person who cannot handle this emotion. Well, what we want to do is actually grow our capacity to handle those emotions. So part of that is going to be changing our stories, changing our narrative. So here in a minute, we'll tell them how to do that.
Yeah. Well, and I also think it's been a while since we talked, I think, specifically about joy pathways. And that is key for, as we go through each of our emotions, one of the reasons why it's important to have storytelling, have stories collected for each of the emotions, is it helps build our joy pathways.
Yes, it's connected. So the joy pathway idea is that pathways form in our brain as neurons connect with each other. The first and most fundamental way that those things connect is not our stories, it is our mirror neurons. Mm-hmm. So the first way that is connect is our mirror neurons watch other people handle emotions and go, oh, that's what that looks like too. So I don't have to blow up just because somebody gets angry at me, or I don't have to shut down just because someone gets angry at me. That's what that looks like. But if I don't, but the second way, if my mirror neurons can't watch somebody do it, the second way I learn is by storytelling. I listen to someone tell me a story of how they handled it, and my mind can imagine that. And so it functions at a slightly lower level, but in a similar fashion. It helps me to imagine what that would look like. And then my brain learns, well, I think I could do that. And so as that happens, neural pathways begin to form in the brain, and it starts as this weak chain, and then it gradually gets stronger as we do it more often. And then the more often we do it, it gets stronger, and then finally it starts to develop white matter and becomes a habit.
Yeah. So we want to start collecting stories about each of our emotions. And if we don't have stories from our own experience that we can lean on right away, we can talk to other people and get their stories. And that is also helpful.
Yes. So, for example, if I don't handle shame well, but you do. You telling me a story of a time you experienced shame and you didn't have to deflect it. You didn't have to put it on somebody else, and you actually were able to remain yourself. That story's going to sound amazing to me because my mind's going to go, you can do that? I mean, that's not how I would have responded. And so listening to you tell stories of how you handled emotions well are not only good for you, but it's good for other people.
Mm-hmm. And then you can add it to your library to pull up when you need to practice and meditate on those kinds of stories. So we are going to talk about the high and low level emotions. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the high level or the high energy emotions. And those are anger and fear. Now, first, in sad, the A is anxiety, and you talk about how actually fear and anxiety are a little bit different. So do you want to start off by explaining that?
I did sad with A is anxiety, and then Jim corrected me. He goes, technically, anxiety and fear are not the same thing. So I'm like, duly noted, but it's already in print. So, we're gonna go with this. And what he said was actually quite helpful, and that is anxiety is always rooted in my beliefs. So what happens here is that the right side of my brain and the left side of my brain mirror each other. So there is, that attachment thing is the thalamus is on the base of both sides. There's an amygdala on both sides. There's cortex on both sides. There's all these things mirror each other. And so what happens is that some of our emotions are triggered because of what's coming up through the right hemisphere of the brain. And we can have other emotions that are triggered by what's coming down on the belief side or the left side where my narratives and beliefs are. And so both can trigger my amygdala, but different sides of the brain. So when my right brain is triggering the amygdala, that's fear. When my left brain is triggering the amygdala because of what I believe, that's anxiety. And so, Jim was like, it's helpful to clarify those and keep those separate, which I get because, as he put it, he said, anxiety is always anchored in imagination. And that is, I can imagine a bad thing happening and I'm reacting in fear to what might happen. And so it's always anchored in a what if kind of scenario. And and then related to that, he said the only thing we truly fear is an emotion we can't handle.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, because I tend to think we fear pain, but he was like, no, actually we fear the emotions that the pain's going to make us feel. Because there's plenty of people who actually look forward to a little bit of pain in a workout or something like that. And like, yeah, I'm going to like that feeling afterwards because it means I'm making progress. So I'm not traumatized by it. There's other kind of pain we feel and we're like, I don't think I ever want to experience that again. The emotional thing that happened with the pain was too great.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. So do you want to talk a little bit more about fear? I think actually it would be interesting since we also call these not just the big six negative emotions, we call them the protector emotions. What's protective about fear?
So these things are meant to protect us from pain, right? Mm-hmm. To a certain extent, to protect us from harm. And so the idea is like if I see a snake and I have no fear, that might not be good, right? Because I'll just keep right on going. So I need a little shot of adrenaline or, to say, hey, you better get out of here. Or if I, it's the same thing. But that fear is not meant to last for more than like 90 seconds. Mm-hmm. And so our problem comes when I don't have that joy pathway in my brain, when I don't have those neural pathways formed. Once that fear gets triggered, I can't get out of it. And that's when it becomes really a problem because now cortisol starts pumping through my brain. It starts eating brain cells. And everything positive that it's been trying to get built through joy gets like shoved into reverse as fear takes over.
Yeah. Well, and it just even reminds me when we talk about needing to tame the amygdala, how so often once you are in a negative emotion, it's even easier to just like snowball into other emotions like, oh, I'm feeling fear, or now I'm feeling anger, and I'm feeling shame for feeling that, and now, oh, I'm just, and it just like snowballs. And so part of taming the amygdala is
right. And part of what's going on there is once you're already in the back of your brain, mm-hmm. if you're staying in the back of your brain, you're in the neighborhood with all those other negative emotions. And so getting out of the back of your brain and back to the front of your brain where your joy center is what the whole point of joy pathways are. How do we get out of here in 90 seconds or less, like the way it's supposed to be? But the reality is if I don't have a big joy center and I don't have those joy pathways, forget 90 seconds. It could be 90 days for some people where they just can't get out of the back of their brain.
Mm-hmm. So, all right, let's talk about the high level emotion, anger. Anger is, on the protector level, it's that I want this injustice or this pain to stop, right? And it can be a positive, very positive thing, but
it can be. So
it can also be very
God gets angry.
Exactly.
Right? God gets angry. And one of the reasons that he gets angry is that people are doing wrong things, right? They're being unjust and they are hurting people and they are doing things that are wrong. And so anger is meant to give us that motivation that we need to make something stop. And that's why there is such a thing as righteous indignation. But I think that when anger gets triggered for a lot of us, the problem is that we don't always have a value system underneath what we're trying to make stop. And so it can take off. And that's why God says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. In other words, it's not meant to last that long. Okay. So,
you're not supposed to live there.
Not supposed to live there.
Yeah. So can you remind us your step acrostic for how to tell a joy story? Or
have we told this before? I'm trying to remember, but I think
we did touch on it last episode.
Okay,
I think.
Okay, so so again, going back to Thrive training. They had what they call 4+ stories. For those people who are familiar with Thrive, that's what they're talking about. And so I was working with Chris, like, hey, can we turn this into something that's easy to remember? And it goes, STEP stands for S is setting. So when I tell the story, I'm like, what's the setting? So you say, well, I was in an airport one night, or I was at a grocery store, or I was at home in bed, whatever it is, but you give the setting of where the story starts. And then you tell T is the trigger. What was the triggering event then that created an emotional reaction for you? Because this is how to tell an emotion story. So I got a setting, and then I got the trigger, and then E is I want to explain the emotion. And when I explain the emotion, I want to show that emotion on my face and with my body. And I want to give a name and words to that emotion. And I want to describe the impact it had on my body. So there's really kind of 3 things connected to emotion, and they're all about explaining it. And that is, how did my body react when I felt that emotion? So it's very important to say, for example, not just I got scared, but, I got scared. My face got hot, my ears, my hair, I could feel standing up. I could feel my stomach going into a knot. It's like, what was going on in your body when you felt the fear? That completes the picture for people of that emotion. And then you go to the point, right? What is the point of the story? And the point of the story, again, if the way that the folks at this event were telling it was, and that's why I messed up. Well, that's not the point we want to make. So the point of the story is one of 3 things generally, and that is, and this is how I acted like myself anyway, and didn't let this turn me into a different person. Or this is how I bounced back and recovered from that emotion. Maybe somebody helped me and somebody gave me another perspective, but I wasn't left alone here and I found my way back. Or thirdly, it's like, no, actually, I totally messed this up. I got, completely taken out by that emotion, but here's what I wish I would have done. And so I bring it back around to turn it into kind of a teaching lesson. So it's the setting, the trigger, the emotion, an explanation of the emotion, and then the point of the story.
Awesome. Well, hey, we're coming up to the end of the episode, and we are going to continue this discussion, especially looking at the low-level emotions next week. But for now, any final thoughts?
Yeah, it's a lot of material, right? And I realized that as going through and learning this through the years, what has amazed me is how completely my paradigm has flipped from thinking that all I needed to do was think right thoughts to realizing that there's a whole nother part of my brain that plays a huge role in my emotions, and that I need to kind of do both. I need to tame the amygdala on the right side of my brain as well as the amygdala on the left. And part of that is reclaiming control of my body through calming, building my capacity through appreciation, and then strengthening all that through the storytelling. So that's where these things come from. And hopefully this is helpful, giving some people some further insight into why we feel the way we do.
Do you want to go back and just give a quick review of what are the high energy emotions and how do we handle them?
Yes. So the amygdala can give us a good, bad, or scary. And if it gives us the assessment, this is scary, it will trigger fear or anger. So those are the two high energy levels, high energy emotions. And what those do is it shoots like adrenaline through our body. And it triggers a physical reaction that either makes us want to fight or flee, and hence the fight or flight reaction. If it goes the other direction, it can trigger low energy emotions that it can suck the life out of us. And that's shame, disgust, sadness, and despair. So last week we looked at anger and fear. This week we're going to be looking at those other four.
And I know we've been taking it more from the storytelling perspective, but could you give some pointers to how you handle high energy emotion? Because like high energy, it literally, I mean, your body has
literally
high
your body
energy.
Shakes, right? Yeah.
So how do you go about handling those from maybe a body standpoint?
So one of the things I'm trying to do is soothe my body. So there's a variety of things that I can do. We call them best practices, right? But there's breathing, which we talk breathe in a box, but the idea is fully filling out your lungs and then fully getting all the air out of your lungs, holding it for a 4 count. You can actually change the numbers. It doesn't always have to be 4. We're just trying to give people a basic model to get started. And you can do that as many times as you need to. I know people have done it 10 times, right, before they finally started to feel a little control. The other is you exaggerate your emotion and then you try to calm it. And so if I was going to put this in order, it would be exaggerate the emotion and then take a deep breath. And then kind of rub your hands down your arms as if you're just rubbing that emotion right out of your body. And then you just repeat, exaggerate, and then, rub it out as you breathe deeply. And then, so that would be breathe in a box, exaggerate, soothe. And then the T, we've actually got 2 different ways we do this. In our new book, we call it, the T is about our thought life. And so one of the things you can do, for instance, Jim Wilder has Shalom Your Body exercise on YouTube that you can watch. And he actually incorporates all 4 of these things in that, and that he exaggerates the emotion and then he's rubbing it out and taking a deep breath. And then sometimes you can and say words that are true. Like, when I am afraid, I will trust in you, O God. Or in some cases, just to distract myself, I've actually sung Happy Birthday to Me, right? Happy birthday to me. And it always makes me smile a little bit. And so that helps. But so those are the best practices for kind of calming my body. The other thing I can do that is similar related to soothing is before I just go straight to trying to soothe my body, I can actually surprise it and exaggerate a little bit, like cold water on the face, a cold shower. Doing something to change your body chemistry can help too.
So what does it look like to exaggerate anger? And also, how do you do that in an appropriate manner?
It's probably not punching a wall, right? Mm-hmm. So you're like, what's an appropriate exaggeration of anger? And that the go-to here is to do the Hulk pose, right? You kind of, flex your arms and make big fists and you flare out your nostrils and I know one guy took a towel and twisted it really hard. And part of the idea here of exaggerating is you want to let that emotion crash like a wave on the shore. Just let it crash over you and release.
Right.
So,
because like if you've ever had somebody say like, "Oh, just calm down," and you're like, "Thanks, I'm so calm now."
Makes you want to punch them.
Yeah,
no, I'm just kidding. It's like, wait, no, did I say that out loud? Okay, no, it's true because there's it's almost impossible to just by sheer force of the will calm yourself down because that's not how it works.
So yeah, well, and I think the reference to the guy with the towel, I mean, he went somewhere private and was just like, and then shook it off.
And that's what happens for some of this stuff. There's things you can do in the moment, and the other thing you can do that's a little bit different is you can use cake. And that is you can break eye contact. Yeah, let's go with that one. So you can break eye contact with somebody. You can find some curiosity, find something to appreciate about the person, find a way to be kind, and then restore eye contact. So curiosity, appreciation, kindness, eye contact, that's cake. And sometimes that's enough just to get you back into the relational part of your brain. And but that's a little bit. One is trying to get recontrol of your body. The other one is trying to get you back to acting like yourself and being relational.
Makes sense. All right. Thank you for that crash course. So this episode, we're talking about our low energy emotions. Could you remind us what are the low energy emotions?
So out of the sad, you take out the 2 A's and you get shame and sadness and disgust and despair. So sadness is the loss of something I value. Shame is the thing that I don't bring you happiness. Like a little kid who is used to seeing mommy and daddy light up when they see them, looks up and mommy and daddy are not happy to see them. Like, what happened? They're feeling, oh, you're not happy to see me. I mean, and the instinct is my body wants to hang my head.
Yeah, hang my head. Don't make eye contact.
Don't make eye contact. Yeah. I want to. I'm kind of hiding in plain sight there. And then sadness, you want to pout, make you want to hang out that bottom lip. You get a little teary, and but it takes the energy out of you. Like, I lost something that was important to me. Then disgust is that yuck feeling that I want to get rid of. I want to get it out of here. Yuck. Ooh, get away from me. And it's actually meant to protect us from poisonous things. And so it might be poisonous people or situations, or actually poisonous foods, but it's that yuck. I want to vomit this out of here. And then despair is, this is impossible. It's the feeling that something I need in order to be okay is not possible.
It's hopeless.
It's hopeless. And so I know Dr. Waters has gotten very specific. It's like, I cannot fix this problem with the time and resources that I have. It's impossible. So the good news here, right, is that God can meet us in every one of these emotions. And one of the problems we sometimes have is that if I don't handle a certain emotion well, I try to keep everybody else from feeling that emotion because I don't want to have to deal with it. And so a lot of us don't allow people to be sad. We don't allow them to feel their shame. We don't allow them to feel, despair or disgust. And it's probably because we don't know how to get back to joy from that emotion. So we don't want to see them going there because we assume they're going to get stuck, and I don't know how to help them get back. And so there's a lot of us who cut people off, right, before instead of validating that emotion and being present with them in it. And that's, I think, an important lesson for us to learn, is that it's okay for people to feel these things. And our response ought to be to meet them there, be happy to be with them, even as they're feeling these things, and try to stay relationally present as they recover.
Well, it reminds me of the very broadly used, make sure your mask is on, in an airplane, your oxygen mask, make sure that's on you first, because if you don't know how to handle it, then, and you're trying to shut it down on other people, like, you will do that to yourself. You'll be avoidant. So you learn, oh, that triggers that emotion in me, and so I don't do that. You might not know it. You might not think that cognizantly, but
I've even heard this actually on radio interviews where the host has asked me a question, and my answer is going and camping out on a low energy emotion a little too long, and they're like, "Well, give us some hope here," and I realize what's happening. It's like, okay, well, we've got limited time. They don't want to camp out on the negatives, inject some hope. But I think a lot of us do that instinctively a lot, and we don't realize that what we're actually doing is not, we're not helping people recover. We're just forcing them to shut down.
And you were using a lot of lingo here that is from VCR. And we've talked about this before, but for people who might be joining us right now for the first time, do you want to remind us what VCR is?
Yeah. So VCR stands for validate, comfort, recover. And so validate is what my right brain does. And that is, I connect with you and your emotion. I non-verbally connect with you, like I'm in sync with what you're feeling. I verbally give it a correct name. And then I verbally identify correctly how big this is for you. Now, when I validate, I don't have to agree that you should be feeling this way, and I don't have to tell you you're right to feel this way. I just have to recognize that this is, in fact, how you feel. That's validation. And then comforting sounds like a right brain thing, but it's actually a left brain exercise, because what you're doing when you comfort is you're making problems more manageable. So it's a problem-solving function. And so the mistake most of us make is we problem solve first and we skip the validation. And so the order is extremely important, because right brain things have to happen before left brain things. It's just the order of the way that the brain works. So we validate first and then we comfort. And if we do those things well, then the person recovers. And we can even do this for ourselves. We can validate our own emotions, comfort ourselves so that we recover.
What does it mean to recover?
So to recover means that I'm back within my window of tolerance, which is a technical term, but it's from Daniel Siegel. But the idea is I'm back within my capacity to handle the emotion, feel like myself, and do the next thing.
So thank you for that. And going back to our low energy emotions, we talked about high energy and needing to soothe
Right. Soothe, quiet, calm. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you help yourself in low energy?
So with low energy emotions, it's almost the opposite, right? I'm trying to get some energy from what's been sucked out of me. And so it helps me to think in these terms. I'm trying to get from the back of my brain to the front of my brain. I'm trying to get from the part of my brain that is sucking the life out of me back to the part of my brain that is my relational self. And so it can help to practice some appreciation, and it can help to connect to somebody but if they're not available, like if somebody's not there to connect with and to help you kind of get back into the relational part of your brain, then practicing appreciation is important. And I will say that quieting can also be a part of this in the sense that I need rhythm to this, right? I've got to have some up and some down. I've got to establish some kind of a rhythm to this. So I would say the key, though, in this one more than anything is the appreciation part. And something we haven't talked much about either is the role of prayer, right? We've been focusing on
the brain science,
right? But I find that sometimes when we pray, it's a lot like storytelling, and that we are telling a story in our prayer. And sometimes I find that my praying is little more than deepening my anxiety because I'm just telling God, I'm scared about this. I don't know how, or my depression. I don't know how I'm going to get out of this. I don't see a solution to this. I just, and it's okay. I could start there, pour out my heart to God, right? And I pour out my heart to God by being completely honest about how deep this goes for me and how much I'm feeling. But the problem comes when I just stop there. I don't want to stop there unless it's just all I got, in which case God rather have that than not. But then the next thing I want to do is change my focus. And that's where I get into the why so downcast, oh my soul, right? I will yet put my hope in you. And so you move from there into reminding yourself of who God is, what God's capable of, what's true about God. And the other tool in prayer is, again, what's often we call the Emmanuel prayer process. But before there was such a thing as Emmanuel prayer, people have been doing this for centuries, which is just listening prayer. And that is forming an attachment with God, where the goal here is really, in brain science terms, to share a mutual mind state with him. So I would say that whether I'm talking to God and pouring out my heart, and then changing my focus to, but I will yet put my trust in you. I will yet, choose to believe that you're going to work this out. I remember your grandfather, for example, when his first wife died. He'd been married for 1 year, and she got sick and just never recovered. They never were able to celebrate their first anniversary. He then moved to New York City from the Midwest, and he didn't know anybody there. He was in seminary. He was all by himself. He was, all alone. And he told me he used to pace his apartment every night and just say to himself again and again, I will choose to believe that God is good, right? I will choose to believe that God is good. And partly what he was doing is he's trying to keep his mind from going into the darkness and just staying there, right? So that story's always stuck with me too, that when you're all alone and there isn't anybody else to connect to, it's okay to pour out my heart to God, but at some point I want to make that pivot and begin focusing on what's true.
Oh, excellent. And a very meaningful story. Love my grandpa. Okay, pulling myself out of grandpa's story.
Yes. Yeah, that was a dark one, but yes,
Yes. Well, so in these we've talked about the fact that sometimes we call them the big six negative emotions, and sometimes we call them the big six protector emotions.
Right.
So could you give us some examples for how some of these could be protective?
Yeah. So when I think about this, one of the first things that pops in my mind is I read Tony Dungy's autobiography, and he had a daughter who had a central nervous system problem that in some places, I think it's called leprosy, right? And this central nervous thing means I don't feel pain. And so what would happen is, for example, she could reach her hand into a oven that was on because she wanted the cookie that she saw when she was little. She could reach in and she would burn herself quite badly and feel no pain. And so if you don't feel pain, you can actually do tremendous damage to yourself. And so emotional pain is the alarm system that God has given to us, that we are about to do damage right here, that we need to stop something, we need to redirect something, or this is going to end very badly. So each of these emotions is meant to trigger an alarm for us to help us realize that there's something off and I need to find a way back to joy and peace from where this has taken me.
Mm-hmm. And will telling a joy story with featuring one of these emotions look the same as anger and fear?
It does in the fact that it follows the step process. You still tell the setting. All right, like my dad's story, the setting. He just moved to New York City. He was all alone. The trigger, his wife had just died. He was in seminary, and he's dealing with this. The emotion was deep attachment pain, deep sadness, right? Despair, right? I've lost the person who made me happy. Is like, so it's grief is this complex, multifaceted emotion. And so he was in this, and then his point was the reminder to himself of what was true, that he couldn't let himself go into the darkness. And so that it still follows that step process of setting, trigger, emotion, and then the point.
Well, and then the rest of that story is he did then meet your mom, my grandma, and
it is a remarkable thing because what happened is the rest of that story is that after seminary, he came back to Fort Wayne Bible College and he taught Greek and he taught missions, and he was the dean of men underneath the dean of students. Well, the dean of students was a man named Elmer Neuenschwander who was married and had a 4-year-old daughter and a brand new baby boy. And he was tragically struck by lightning out on a golf course. So all of a sudden there was a widow on campus, and then my dad, who was a widower. And because he was a widower, he was in a unique position, right, to connect. Well, they ended up getting married. She became my mom and your grandma. And so for 50 some years, they were together. And most people don't know my dad was ever married before that, but that he was with my mom, Eleanor, for over 50 years.
Mm-hmm. It always
we could go on.
It
right?
always just makes me think of the mercy of God. Yeah.
And he brought something good out of the bad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I wanted to touch on this, so I'm glad you brought it up in Grandpa's story, which is attachment pain, which is not one of the big six. Can you explain why?
Yeah, I mean, attachment pain is the deepest pain that that a human being can feel, because it's the deepest part of our brain system where the limbic system, the nervous system, and all that are just connecting to the brain. At that very deep level is my cravings center. And so if I have a craving for attachment, and that attachment is impossible, right? That is an incredibly deep pain. And then we call that attachment pain. It's not just sadness. It is the inability to connect when I desperately need connection. And it's dark. And that's why a lot of poetry, right? A lot of love songs, a lot of movies, kind of center around this idea of attachment pain. In fact, I've been told that like Middle Eastern love romantic poems are not about how wonderful you are. It's about how deep my despair is if I can't have you, if I can't be with you, right? And they're all about attachment pain.
Part of tearing down the house of fear and building a house of joy is learning to joy map instead of fear map our world. And toxic thoughts can affect our outlook on life and sow discord in our relationships with God and with others, and even affect our bodies. So, Dad, let's do a little bit more brain science. Can you explain for us the VLE, the verbal logical explainer, and how it affects our thoughts?
All right. So the VLE, to my knowledge, it was Dr. Carl Lehman, board-certified psychiatrist and one of the founders of Emmanuel Prayer Ministry, who coined that term, VLE. It occurs in his book, Outsmarting Yourself. And the idea here is, in kind of layman's terms, right? The right side of your brain has an experience and the left side of your brain has to interpret it. But if the right side of your brain goes into a cramp and shuts down so that you don't get your higher level brain functions, then it shoots that interpretive process prematurely over to the left side of the brain, which now is trying to create a simple narrative to explain what you're feeling without all the data. I don't know.
Very good. And also, I just have to clarify, were layman's terms or layman's terms?
Yeah. No, that's a good clarification. For people who are not board certified psychiatrists and do not have
that sort of layman,
and
not layman.
I didn't even think about that. That's true. It's a complicated word, right? Verbal and logical and explainer. So the idea here is that the kind of the cognitive engine on the left side of our brain puts into words what we're thinking and attaches a narrative to it and tries to come up with a logical explanation for what we're feeling. And so the classic example I've heard used is you're walking down the street and somebody with red hair walks by and all of a sudden you feel incredible sadness and you don't know why. So your verbal logical explainer will create a narrative for you to explain why you're feeling this way. And it could be dead wrong, right? It could say, well, you have some traumatic memory with red-haired people, or, it just doesn't know, but it's going to put together whatever data it does have and create a logical narrative out of it, no matter whether it's true or not. And so the idea is that one of the reasons that this is so important is that our emotions don't really know fact from fiction. And we can't rely on our emotions. Just because something feels really true to us doesn't mean that it's true.
I was just in a book club with some friends, and we were talking about how somebody just asked, like, have you ever noticed that what you're reading just affects your mood or whatever? Like, oh, I'm reading this book, and the book we were reading at that point, there was a husband who left his family, and one of my friends was like, my husband is here and great, but he walked in the door and I was like,
I'm mad at you. I'm mad at all men.
Yeah. And she was like, and I had to walk myself back. Like, no, I'm not mad at my husband right now. I was very engrossed in that story.
Yeah.
And everybody was just like sharing like, yep. I catch myself in that all the time. Like, oh, this was a sad book or this was a happy book or whatever. And it like affects.
Well, it's the same with music. I remember when I was, your age, I was painting houses for a living, and it was common to have the radio on in the background. And some days we'd be listening to music, and most music are love songs. And so you find yourself thinking about relationships and girls you've known and all this other stuff because of the music is just on that theme. And other times you're listening to political commentary shows, and so your mind's on all the stuff going on in the culture. And other times you're listening to a baseball game or something like that. And it just so radically affects kind of the mood you're in and the thoughts that are run through your head. And which is why the Bible tells us meditate on the word of God, in the morning and in the evening. Do this regularly. Keep your mind on things like this because it is so easy for us to get caught up in the world of emotions created by our narratives.
Yeah, I often think about it in terms of like, what is discipling you? And that can even, what is discipling your emotions? What is, yeah. Anyway, so that made me think of that. What are some common sources for toxic thoughts? Like, are they always just triggered by, amygdala or
toxic thoughts. I say ultimately it all goes back to the devil, right? Because his title is the father of lies. So father means I'm the fountainhead of something. I'm the source of all of it. So the idea is that if there is a lie I'm believing, if there's a false toxic belief, then ultimately the devil's responsible for it. So it doesn't mean the devil's talking to me. It doesn't even mean I have a demon, but it means at some level it puts me in sync with that side of the equation, and it puts me in step with what the father of lies is doing and not what the spirit of truth is doing. And so if I want to keep in step with the spirit, right, then I've got to learn how to take thoughts captive, how to attack these toxic thoughts so I can get myself back in step with God.
So we'll often talk about the world, the flesh, and the devil. And they give you us different, you might pass a billboard, or you might have somebody stir up anger in you, or I don't know. I'm not saying this well, but...
So the way Carl Payne explains this is the world is anything external to me that is triggering something. And the flesh is anything internal to me that is triggering something. And so the example I've heard him use many times is if I go past a billboard and I see a picture of a donut, all of a sudden I'm thinking about donuts. I wasn't thinking about donuts till I saw the billboard. Said on the other hand, I could be home alone, on my bed and start thinking about donuts. I don't need he said, that's my flesh. That's coming from inside of me. And then in a very bizarre scenario, the devil might whisper, donuts. Yeah. I'm sure he has his favorites too. Yeah, no,
I'm
it's
sorry. I'm getting slap happy. Okay. So how do we handle toxic thoughts do we handle toxic thoughts differently depending on where they come from?
Yes. So again, referring back to Carl, Dr. Payne, with things coming from the world, the answer is to run, right? So flee sexual immorality, flee the things of the world. Like he used the example of somebody who would drive home past a porn shop on his way home, and too often he found himself pulling in. And so Dr. Payne's solution was, well, drive a different way home. The guy was like, but that would take an extra half an hour. And I'm like, ask your wife which one she prefers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's like, run from that. Don't put yourself in that position. Get away from it. Internally, you can't run away from yourself, right? It's kind of with you. So you have to replace. You have to replace the thoughts. So you run from the one, you replace with the other. If you can't run and you can't replace, then you're probably dealing with an attack from the enemy, and that's resist. So you resist the enemy and you make him run, right? You make him flee. And so those are the 3 core strategies.
Cool. If our toxic thoughts are triggered by an upset emotion, what is a good strategy for attacking those thoughts?
Well, let me just say, first of all, that when it comes to emotions, our thought life runs 2 directions. One is our emotions can trigger thoughts. So sometimes because I'm feeling this emotion, it's reminding me of all the things that I tend to think when I feel this way. On the other hand, my emotions can get triggered by what I'm thinking. So we're very familiar with that one, right? And that is that my what I believe triggers the way I feel, but it can go the other way around too. And that is what I'm feeling can trigger what I'm thinking about. So we kind of need for both. So when we talk about resisting the devil and fleeing from the world and, replacing toxic thoughts, those are all strategies that are related to this. At its heart, when it comes to like my emotions triggering thoughts, I got this idea, and it really was crystallized for me by Dr. Daniel Amen, who was describing these as automatic negative thoughts, or ants. And the automatic negative thoughts tend to swarm, right, whenever we feel these emotions. And so he tells the story about an 8-year-old boy, who was struggling with anxiety and depression. And he taught this boy how to, in Christian terms, take his thoughts captive, but how to turn his brain into an anteater by coming up with a game plan that says, you know what, every time I feel these emotions, the same thoughts keep coming up in my head. So why don't I go ahead and come up with a game plan for what I'm going to do the next time this happens? And that game plan is, what are the new thoughts I'm going to replace those old thoughts with? So I think that's hugely helpful.
Well, and it's helpful to make like a T-bar chart.
Yeah, so that's what the point of a T-bar chart is. Like on one side of the chart, you've got, this is what I currently believe. That's when I feel upsetting things. And on the other side is, this is what God wants me to be thinking instead. So you can think of it, these are the lies and this is the truth. But honestly, that can be confusing for people, because sometimes the beliefs that are coming don't feel like lies, and sometimes they're not total lies, right? And so we just say, these are the beliefs, the toxic thinking that kind of robs me of my peace.
These are the automatic negative thoughts.
These are the automatic negative thoughts on this side. These are the anteater thoughts on the other side. So I do find that helpful. First time I actually saw this in person as an actual strategy, as my first week as a pastor. And a lady in the church lost her college-age son in a tragic car accident. He was engaged to be married. He had just graduated. He was about to go to med school in the fall. I mean, and it goes on and on and on. But but what I associate it with this is, I gave her the assignment to keep a journal, and I said, and start your day every morning by asking God 2 questions. So number 1, what lies does the devil want me to believe today? What is the devil's attacking thought for me today? Write it down. And then say, God, what is the thought you want me to hold on to instead? So that you're just going to replace that immediately, and you've got your strategy and your start. So it's like day by day, building out your strategy against this. Well, several years later, she emailed me and basically said, thank you for that exercise. It probably saved my life. Right. And because that's how profound our thought life can be when it comes to this stuff.
Well, and it makes so much sense because, another paradigm that we talk about a lot is WLVS, wounds, lies, vows, strongholds. So if you have been wounded and you are actively watching for the lies and replacing them with truth and seeking God in the midst of it, then hopefully you won't carry out the rest of that pattern, right?
Exactly. And that's where the real prayer pattern actually comes from, is that what happens when we invite Jesus to meet us in painful memories is we get two things. One, we get an attachment with somebody who's happy to be with us in that memory so that we're not alone in it. And secondly, we get a new perspective on the memory. We get truth that replaces the lies. So it uproots the lies, replaces it with truth, and it takes out the sense of being alone in what we're going through because Jesus is there with us. So in that sense, it addresses both the right and the left brain issues that we have, our right brain attachment needs and our left brain narrative.
Mm-hmm. And we talked about real prayer several episodes ago. So if anybody is jumping in new to the Joy series.
Yeah, real prayer is remember the past wound, explore that wound, ask Jesus to heal it, pay it, and then listen to what he does and look around and revisit the memory and see if anything changes. So that's the super simple overview.
Mm-hmm. So in the context of CASA, which is the acrostic that you use in your new book, The 4 Habits of Joy-Filled People, attacking toxic thinking is the final A. You have calming and appreciating and storytelling and attacking toxic thinking. And how do you envision, is this just an a la carte, you do these things when, you need them, or is there a generally best practice order?
Well, if you think about it, the first two, calming and appreciating, are largely the right brain building activities, and the storytelling and the attacking toxic thinking is the left brain. So that's dealing with our narrative. And the other one is dealing with the appreciation. Kind of connects to both, but appreciation by its nature is relational because I'm grateful to someone, right? So so what happens is that as a general pattern, practicing these things over time create habits, which is where the title comes from, right? That is, I want to develop the habit of calming quickly. I want to develop the habit of bouncing back, right? And I want to practice the habit of turning my brain into something that amplifies appreciation instead of fear. And then I want to get in the habit of telling myself stories and sharing with other people these emotional stories that have a positive point to them. And then where I turn my brain into an anteater, after a while, it starts attacking these toxic thoughts automatically without me. It's no longer a laborious conscious process that I'm going through. So to that extent, all of these things could be thought of like, learning to play the piano. It's going to go slow and maybe be awkward at first, but the more we practice it, it gets to be second nature. And then we can start just kind of experiencing it instead of thinking our way through every step.
Yeah. Well, and on the relational note, I know I made a joke at the beginning that we're talking about attacking toxic thinking in ourselves and not others. But if you are, if you have a loved one or somebody who is, that they're having toxic thoughts, could you give us just maybe a tip or a strategy for maybe how to help them or to help yourself with them?
Well, yeah, it's this brings us back honestly to the VCR concept, and that is the main thing we want to do is keep a relational bridge open. There's an exception to this I'll get to in a second, but what we want to do is keep the relational bridge open and focus on validating the emotions and making sure they know that we are happy to be with them, even if they don't agree with us. And it's all part of that loving your enemies thing that Jesus talks about, right? So when I say there's an exception to it, I'm going to Matthew 23, and Jesus talking to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, and he's calling them snakes and vipers, right? And saying that they're sons of hell, that they're going to hell, that their destiny is deserved, right? What is up with that, right? What is up? And I'm like, that doesn't sound like loving your enemies when you first look at it. But when you think about it this way, those people were on their way to hell. They were blind guides who were going in a bad direction And Jesus knew they needed a jolt, right? They needed something to really wake them up from this. And there is a time for brutal honesty, right?
And I would also say that they are supposed to be the mouthpieces of God for that generation, and they were not being.
No, they were the mouthpieces for Satan, right? And so it was, and so you look at that and you're like, sometimes getting in somebody's face is the most loving thing you can do. It's just that we're so quick to justify our actions that we have to be really careful about. That's one thing when Jesus is doing it, because, his motivations are right. In our case, we want to, as much as possible, make sure that we're validating first and then comforting. And comforting is where we share truth. Because part of comforting is giving people a new perspective. And sometimes we can do that in a way where it's like with an intervention with somebody where it's like, hey, you got to wake up to what's going on here. And the most loving thing you can do is have the intervention. But you want to make sure that you're doing it out of love. The danger comes when we are brutally honest with people for our own benefit, not theirs. And that is, I just want this to go away. I don't like having to deal with this. I don't like how it makes me feel because, and so what I'm really just trying to do is fix them quick so that I don't have to deal with this anymore. And that's the flesh. That is not love.
Mm-hmm. What about just like casual, maybe something isn't, high energy, toxic thinking, but it's just, I can tell this person is just constantly fear mapping the world. And how do I protect myself from now fear mapping like them? Or how do I help insert some joy? I don't know.
Yeah.
That could be too big of a topic right here.
It's a pretty big topic, but I will say that, there's a temptation to avoid here, and that is taking responsibility for them. Like it is now my job to fix the way they look at the world. So we do have to be spirit led in this, because there's not always a concrete principle. Do it this way. This is what you do. Sometimes it's like, God, how do you want me to handle this in the moment?
Amen.
When I am going to talk to somebody about their thinking, part of this is finding out how open they are, right? Because there's some people who are locked in their thinking and they don't want any help. And you're just going to become their adversary by trying to help them. And you got to decide, is this?
I mean, are there nonverbal things though that, or is
well, nonverbals, yeah. I mean, you want to show in your body and your face that you understand how they're feeling. You want to stay eye contact and present without staring them down and making them feel like what? What? Are you crazy? You got to be careful of your nonverbals and stuff like this, because you can say all the right things, but all your nonverbals are saying the opposite. So we are trying to connect with people in the emotion that they're actually experiencing, and then see how open they are to movement. And beyond that, I'm not sure I have a clear principle in mind.
Okay.
Do you have one in mind?
I mean, I didn't going into that, but as you were talking about, I was thinking about all the different levels of where you meet people, like if they're at different levels of the brain and where you meet them at in those levels. But that would be a whole different episode.
Yes. We actually have 5 S's around that. Exactly. So, and I don't know if I can pull them off the top of my head right now. So yeah.
Yeah, no worries. There was a lot of good here, and we are coming up to the end of the episode. So do you have any closing thoughts to wrap up attacking toxic thinking?
Yeah. Well, I remember walking into a Starbucks one time and seeing an ad for an Alcoholics Anonymous on the bulletin board. And I laughed when I got to the bottom of the brochure, because it said, just ignore that committee in your head. I'm like, how many of us can kind of relate to that? Like what's really hard is sometimes I've got anxious thoughts, despairing thoughts, disgusting thoughts, angry thoughts, fearful. Like I have all of these thoughts pulling me in different directions. The Bible talks about a double-minded man being unstable in all of his ways. If you think about it, what it means to be double-minded, it means I'm being pulled in different directions internally by the narratives that are running through my head. So part of this is trying to sort out the emotions, sort out the narratives that are connected to the emotions. And sometimes I got to just tell the devil, get out of here, or distract myself out of it and ask God to give me something true to focus on instead. And I found in my own journey that sometimes it's not helpful to try to figure it all out. Sometimes it's not helpful in the moment to try to figure out, why am I feeling this way? What am I exactly? Sometimes it's okay just to distract yourself out of it and find something else to think about and just replace the thought. Long term, we may need some help with a counselor or a prayer minister, to get at some of those roots. So I think there's a difference between in the moment and long term.
Thanks for joining us on the trail today. Did you like this episode? Would you like more people to see it? This is the part where I ask you to like, comment, subscribe, share with a friend. And do you love this channel? One of the best ways that you can support us is by becoming a Deeper Walk Trailblazer. Thanks again. We'll see you back on the trail next week.